Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, settle in, and prepare for another journey into the past. Tonight, we're stepping into the arena, not as spectators in the safety of the stands, but as the main attraction. We're exploring what it was really like to be a Roman gladiator, and I promise you, it was nothing like Russell Crowe made it look. Our journey tonight takes us to ancient Rome, roughly between the 1st century BC and the 4th century AD, during the height of gladiatorial games. This isn't the Hollywood version with honorable warriors choosing death with dignity and crowds roaring with respect. This is the real experience, the slavery, the exploitation, the calculated cruelty, and the daily reality that you were properly designed to die entertainingly for people who saw you as less than human. Before we begin, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. And if there's another historical topic you'd like us to explore, let me know. Your suggestions help shape these journeys through time. Now, let's enter the ludus and discover what really awaited a Roman gladiator. Nobody dreamed of becoming a gladiator. It wasn't a career aspiration. It was a death sentence dressed up as entertainment. The path to the arena came through 3 main routes, and none of them involved choice, glory, or anything remotely resembling the heroic narrative Hollywood sells us. It was slavery, desperation, or punishment, and regardless of which door you entered through, they all led to the same place, a training facility where you learned to die entertainingly. The most common route was being a prisoner of war. When Rome conquered territories, and Rome was constantly conquering territories, defeated soldiers faced several fates. The lucky ones were sold into agricultural slavery, which was brutal, but at least offered a longer life expectancy. The unlucky ones were sent to the arena. It was like being captured in war, and instead of being a prisoner, you're told you'll be forced to fight to the death for entertainment while people eat snacks. And if you were a particularly impressive warrior who had fought well against Roman legions, congratulations! You just earned yourself a ticket to gladiator school. The Romans appreciated martial skill even in their enemies, and they saw profit potential in forcing you to use those skills for their amusement. It was like being headhunted for a job based on your combat resume, except the job was killing or being killed, and you had no choice about accepting the position. Criminals sentenced to the arena, damnatio ad gladium or damnatio ad bestias, made up another significant portion of gladiators. If you committed serious crimes against the Roman state, you might be sentenced to fight in the arena. This wasn't professional gladiator training. This was execution, disguised as entertainment. You were given minimal weapons, minimal training, and sent out to die as part of the morning warm-up acts before the real gladiators performed. It was the death penalty, except instead of a quick execution, you died slowly while providing entertainment value. Then there were the volunteers, the authorati, which sounds better until you realize that volunteer in this context meant person so desperately poor or indebted that death in the arena seemed preferable to their current circumstances. These were free Roman citizens who literally sold themselves into gladiatorial slavery for a signing bonus and the distant hope of prize money if they survived long enough to win fights. It was like someone so broke they volunteered for medical experiments, except the experiments definitely involved getting stabbed and the survival rate was terrible. The authorati signed contracts, legal documents that stripped them of their citizenship rights and made them property of the lanista, the gladiator trainer who owned the school. They swore an oath, I will endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. It was a contract where the terms explicitly included your own death, and you signed it anyway because your alternatives were somehow worse. Your arrival at the Ludus, the gladiator training facility, was the moment your old identity died, even if your body remained temporarily alive. You were stripped, examined like livestock at auction, and evaluated for your potential value as entertainment. Strong build, you might become a heavily armed fighter. Quick and agile, perhaps a lightly armed specialist. Older or weaker, you'd probably die in the preliminary matches that warmed up the crowd. It was like a job interview where they evaluated your suitability for different roles, except all the roles involved combat death, and you had no say in the assignment. Your head was shaved both for hygiene in the cramped quarters you'd share with dozens of other gladiators and as a mark of your new status. You were branded or tattooed, literally marked as property. You were given a new name, often related to your place of origin or your fighting style. Your old name, your old identity, your old life. All of it was stripped away. It was like entering witness protection, except instead of protection, you got slavery and scheduled death. The psychological impact of this transition was profound. Yesterday, you might have been a soldier, a farmer, a merchant. Today, you were a slave trained to kill other slaves for the amusement of people who considered you less than human. Some men broke immediately, becoming hollow shells who went through training motions without hope. Others raged against their fate, which usually meant being beaten until they learned that compliance delayed death, even if it didn't prevent it. A few adapted, finding ways to survive psychologically in circumstances designed to destroy them. It was like being kidnapped into a cult, except the cult's core belief was that your life had value only as entertainment. And from day one, you understood the fundamental truth of your new existence. You were an investment that would eventually be expended. The lanista who owned you paid for your purchase or contract. He'd pay for your training, your food, your housing. Every coin spent on you was calculated against your potential to generate profit through ticket sales and betting. You weren't a person. You were a financial instrument with a limited useful life. And your job was to maximize return on investment before your inevitable expiration. It was like being a rental car, except the rental car was a human being and the wear and tear was lethal. Training at the Ludus wasn't boot camp. It was a factory for manufacturing entertaining deaths. The facility itself was a prison designed to look like a training ground, with high walls, guards at every exit, and accommodations that made military barracks look luxurious. It was like a combination prison, gym, and slaughterhouse, where the product was combat-ready human beings with carefully calculated skills designed to make their deaths as dramatic as possible. Your day began before dawn because sleep was considered wasteful when you could be training for your upcoming death. A gong or bell woke everyone simultaneously, and you had minutes to be in the training yard. There was no snooze button, no gradual waking. You went from sleep to full alertness instantly because guards with sticks enforced punctuality. It was like the worst alarm clock imaginable, except the alarm clock was a man with a club who would hit you if you weren't fast. The training yard was packed earth, hardened by years of feet, pounding it during practice. It was surrounded by walls high enough that escape was impossible, and guards were positioned to watch every moment. This was where you'd spend most of your waking hours learning to kill and die, according to specific rules designed to maximize entertainment value. It was like a combination of a prison yard and a theater stage where every movement was rehearsed for an audience that would cheer your death. Your doctores, the trainers, were often retired gladiators who had survived long enough to buy their freedom or been granted it after exceptional careers. They knew every technique because they'd used them to kill dozens of men. They understood the arena because they'd nearly died in it repeatedly, and they had no sympathy for your situation because they'd been through worse, survived. It was like having coaches who were combat veterans of a sport where losing meant death, and their coaching style reflected that reality. Training began with conditioning that would make modern boot camps look gentle. You ran, jumped, climbed, and performed endless physical drills designed to build the strength and endurance needed for combat. This wasn't fitness for health. This was conditioning, so you could fight multiple rounds without collapsing, because a gladiator who got tired and died quickly wasn't entertaining enough. It was like training for a marathon, except the marathon involved weapons, and the finish line was your own death. After conditioning came weapons training, but not with real weapons, with wooden training equipment that was deliberately heavier than actual combat gear. You practiced with wooden swords called rudis that weighed more than real gladi. You trained with wooden shields heavier than the real bronze ones. The theory was that training with heavy equipment would make actual combat easier. The reality was that it was another way to break you down while building specific muscle memory. It was like practicing basketball with a bowling ball. Technically, it might help, but mostly, it just made everything harder. You practiced the same movements hundreds, thousands times. Thrust, parry, block, dodge, thrust again. Over and over until the movements became reflexive, until your body executed them without conscious thought. But these weren't just combat moves. They were theatrical movements designed to look dramatic from the stands. You learned to fight effectively, yes, but also to fight entertainingly. A quick, efficient kill wasn't valuable. A dramatic, prolonged combat that kept crowds engaged was the goal. It was like learning martial arts, except style points mattered more than effectiveness, and the style points determined whether you lived or died. Different gladiator types required different training. Murmillo fighters wore heavy armor and fought with sword and shield. They trained for strength and endurance. Retiarii used nets and tridents. They trained for speed and precision. Thrax fighters used curved swords and small shields. They specialized in agility. Your body type, your skills, and the Lanista's business calculations determined which type you'd become. It was like being assigned a character class in a video game, except the game was real, and your class determined how you'd eventually die. Sparring practice was conducted with extreme care, not because the trainers cared about your safety, but because injured gladiators couldn't generate profit. You practiced against other trainees using the heavy wooden weapons, learning to read opponents, anticipate moves, and respond reflexively. The doctors stopped fights before serious injury occurred not out of mercy, but out of financial prudence. It was like having protective equipment during practice, except the protection was economic rather than humanitarian. The palace, a thick wooden post set in the ground, became your constant companion. You practiced strikes against it endlessly, building muscle memory and conditioning your hands and arms to withstand the impact of hitting hard objects. The Palus didn't flinch, didn't block, didn't provide the satisfaction of victory. It just stood there while you hit it thousands of times, building calluses on your hands and numbness in your soul. It was like having a heavy bag for boxing practice, except the heavy bag was your entire training partner, and hitting it was your primary activity for months. Psychological training was as important as physical conditioning. You were desensitized to violence gradually, watching experienced gladiators train, observing fights, and eventually witnessing deaths. You learned to see combat not as terrifying, but as routine, not as murder, but as performance. This psychological conditioning was necessary because a gladiator who froze in terror during his first fight wasn't entertaining. It was like exposure therapy for combat, except instead of treating trauma, they were creating conditions where you could inflict trauma effectively. The hierarchy within the ludus was strict and brutal. Experienced gladiators, those who had won multiple fights, had better accommodations, better food, and higher status. New recruits lived in the worst conditions and received the hardest treatment. This hierarchy served multiple purposes. It gave successful gladiators something to lose. It motivated new fighters to survive long enough to improve their conditions. And it created a social structure that made managing dozens of dangerous men easier. It was like a prison gang system where your rank determined your treatment and violence enforced the hierarchy. Punishments for poor performance, disobedience, or attempted escape were severe. Beatings were standard. Isolation in dark cells was common. Reduced rations weakened troublemakers. And for serious infractions, you might be sent to the arena with no training against impossible odds. Public execution disguised as a fight. It was discipline enforced through fear and pain, because men who expected to die needed stronger motivation than those who hoped to live. The training regime 6 was days relentless, dawn to dusk, with only basic breaks for meals and minimal rest. Your muscles ached constantly. Your body bore bruises from training. Your mind was numb from repetition. But you continued because stopping meant punishment, and poor performance meant being assigned to fights you couldn't win. It was like the worst job imaginable, except you couldn't quit, and the performance reviews were life or death. And through all of this, you were learning not just to fight, but to accept your fate. The training wasn't just about teaching combat skills. It was about breaking your spirit, eliminating hope, and molding you into someone who would walk into the arena and perform their own death, entertaining for others. Some men resisted this psychological conditioning, maintaining their humanity and hope despite everything. Others accepted it completely, becoming empty shells who killed efficiently but felt nothing. Most existed somewhere in between. Broken enough to comply but not so broken, they lost the survival instinct that made them valuable. It was like Stockholm Syndrome combined with combat training, creating men who were simultaneously victims and weapons, slaves and performers, human beings and expendable entertainment. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you. Gladiators were fed relatively well, but not because anyone cared about their well-being. You were fed the way you'd fatten livestock before a slaughter, with specific nutritional goals designed to maximize your value as entertainment. The diet was calculated to build muscle mass quickly, create subcutaneous fat that would make wounds bleed more dramatically, and keep you alive long enough to generate profit. It was like being on a meal plan designed by someone who wanted you to look impressive while dying. Your diet centered around barley, so much barley that gladiators were nicknamed horderi, barley men, barley porridge for breakfast, barley bread for lunch, barley as the base of evening stew. This grain was chosen because it was cheap, it put weight on quickly, and it created a layer of fat under the skin that made combat wounds bleed impressively without immediately killing you. It was like being force-fed oatmeal 3 times daily, except the oatmeal was strategically designed to make your eventual death more visually entertaining. The scientific reasoning behind this was surprisingly sophisticated. Romans understood that fighters needed calories for intense training, and that certain body compositions made better arena spectacles. Lean, muscular fighters died too quickly from wounds. Blood loss killed them before audiences got their money's worth. But fighters with a layer of fat bled dramatically, creating the visual spectacle crowds loved, while the fat layer meant wounds had to penetrate deeper to hit vital organs. You were literally being fattened to bleed better. It was like discovering your diet plan was designed not for health, but for theatrical death. Protein came from beans, lentils, and occasionally cheaper cuts of meat. Nothing quality, nothing that would be served to actual citizens, but enough to build muscle on your barley-thickened frame. The diet was protein-heavy by ancient standards because muscle mass was part of the show. Audiences wanted to see impressive physical specimens fighting, not emaciated slaves. It was like bodybuilder meal prep, except the bodybuilding was to make you look good while dying in public. You drank pasca, a mixture of water and vinegar that sounds disgusting and absolutely was disgusting. This acidic drink served multiple purposes. It made stored water safer by killing bacteria, it provided some electrolytes after intense training, and it was cheap enough that even slaves could have it freely. It tasted like drinking salad dressing, but you drank it anyway because the alternative was water that might kill you faster than your scheduled arena death. It was like a sports drink designed by someone who hated you and had a very limited budget. Meals were communal, eaten in a large hall with benches and tables where dozens of gladiators ate together. This wasn't pleasant family dining. It was functional feeding where guards watched to prevent fights and ensure everyone ate their assigned portions. The hierarchy evident everywhere else in the ludus appeared here too. Successful gladiators with multiple victories got larger portions, better seating, and occasionally treats like fruit or better wine. New recruits got basic rations and the worst seats. It was like a school cafeteria with a rigid caste system enforced by threat of violence. The food was cooked by slaves who were lower in status than even gladiators. If you were enslaved to serve enslaved fighters, you were truly at the bottom of Roman social hierarchy. These cooks prepared massive quantities of barley porridge, bean stew, and bread using huge cauldrons and ovens. Quality wasn't a consideration. Quantity and caloric density were what mattered. It was industrial food service, except the industry was death entertainment. Special dietary supplements were occasionally provided. Gladiators were sometimes given bone ash or other calcium supplements, based on Roman medical theory that believed it strengthened bones. Whether it actually helped is debatable, but the intent shows how methodically gladiators were maintained as valuable property. It was like giving vitamins to livestock, which essentially is what you were. Before fights, your diet changed. Some lanistae restricted food the day before a match. believing hungry fighters were more aggressive. Others provided extra rations, hoping well-fed fighters would have more stamina. There was no scientific consensus, just various theories about how to optimize human beings for entertaining combat death. It was like having a pre-game meal plan designed by people guessing about optimal nutrition for mortal combat. The psychological aspect of this forced feeding regime was interesting. You were being nourished by the same people who would send you to die. You ate food paid for by the profits of previous gladiators' deaths. Every meal was a reminder that you were valuable property, valuable enough to feed well, but still property whose ultimate purpose was death. It was like being served a last meal every day, except the execution kept getting postponed as long as you remained profitable. Some gladiators developed strange relationships with food. Eating became the one reliable pleasure in lives defined by violence and fear. Others couldn't eat properly, anxiety and stress destroying their appetites despite the forced feeding regime. A few used food as one of the only forms of control they had, eating slowly, savoring every bite as an act of defiance against the efficiency-driven system. It was finding humanity in the most basic acts because almost everything else had been stripped away. And here's a dark irony. You probably ate better as a gladiator than you would have as a free poor person in Rome. The barley diet with protein supplements and regular meals was more nutrition than many free Romans received. This wasn't generosity, it was economics. You were valuable property that needed maintenance, but the fact remained that slavery as a gladiator sometimes included better nutrition than freedom in poverty. It was a situation where the cage came with better food than liberty, which made the cage somehow more cruel. Your living quarters at the ludus reflected your status as valuable property that still needed to be imprisoned. The cells, because that's what they were, cells not rooms, were small, cramped, and designed for security rather than comfort. You shared these spaces with other gladiators, sometimes 4 to 6 men in a room barely large enough for 2. It was like a college dorm room, except you couldn't leave. Your roommates were trained killers, and everyone knew most of you would die violently within a few years. The cell contained the absolute minimum: sleeping platforms that were essentially stone shelves with thin mattresses if you were lucky, straw if you weren't. A single small window provided minimal light and air, large enough for ventilation, but too small for escape. The door was heavy wood reinforced with iron, locked from the outside, with a small opening for guards to observe you. It was a prison cell that didn't pretend to be anything else. Privacy didn't exist. You slept, dressed, and lived in constant proximity to others. The other men in your cell were competitors for survival, potential allies, and unavoidable companions. Tensions were inevitable when you packed dangerous men into tiny spaces with no privacy and constant stress. Fights broke out regularly. Some men formed alliances or friendships born of shared misery. Others became enemies, their confined space amplifying every irritation. It was like the worst roommate situation imaginable, except your roommates were literally trained to kill and you couldn't move out. The walls bore marks of previous occupants, scratches, prayers to gods, tallies of fights survived, names of loved ones. These markings were layers of history, testament to the men who had lived and died as gladiators before you. Some marked the days until their next fight. Others scratched prayers or curses. A few drew crude pictures of the life they'd left behind. The walls were archives of desperation. It was like reading graffiti that was simultaneously historical record and collective suicide note. Sanitation was minimal. A communal latrine served the entire ludus, a room with stone seats over a channel where water flowed, carrying waste away. Privacy was non-existent even here. You relieved yourself alongside other men, this most private of acts made public, because privacy was a luxury slaves didn't deserve. The smell was perpetual and awful. Disease spread easily in these conditions. It was like the worst public restroom imaginable, except it was your only option, and using it was a daily humiliation. Bathing facilities existed, but were basic. Cold water, communal baths where you washed alongside dozens of others. Warm baths existed for successful gladiators who had won multiple fights, a privilege that motivated you to survive long enough to earn better conditions. The water was rarely changed, so you were essentially bathing in water that had already cleaned dozens of sweaty, bloody men. It was like a gym shower, except worse because the water was shared and cold and you were property. Medical facilities were surprisingly sophisticated, not because Romans cared about gladiator well-being, but because injured property that couldn't be healed couldn't generate profit. The ludus had medical staff who understood combat injuries better than most physicians. They could set bones, stitch wounds, remove embedded weapons, and keep men alive who probably should have died. It was excellent emergency medicine in service of eventually sending you back to risk death again. Like having good workers' compensation coverage, except the work was fighting to the death, and the compensation was being healed enough to do it again. The infirmary was where you went after training injuries or between fights if you survived wounded. It smelled of blood, infection, and the herbs used to treat wounds. Men lay on simple cots, some recovering, others dying slowly from infections no Roman medicine could cure. The medical slaves worked efficiently, treating injuries with the detachment of mechanics repairing tools. You were given pain relief if available, usually wine or herbal mixtures, and expected to recover quickly, because time not training was time not improving your skills. It was like an emergency room designed for throughput rather than comfort. At night, locked in your cell with other condemned men, the psychological reality of your situation became inescapable. During the day, training kept your mind occupied, but at night, you lay in darkness thinking about the arena, about the fights you'd witnessed, about the very real possibility that you'd die entertaining people who saw you as less than human. Sleep was difficult. Nightmares were common. Some men cried quietly, trying not to show weakness. Others prayed to whatever gods they still believed might save them. A few simply stared at the darkness, their humanity slowly eroding under the weight of their reality. The social dynamics in these confined spaces were complex. Friendships formed based on shared suffering, men finding connection in circumstances designed to isolate them. But these friendships were compromised by the knowledge that you might face each other in the arena someday. The lanista sometimes deliberately paired friends against each other, believing the emotional conflict made better entertainment. It was like developing close relationships in a situation designed to eventually destroy them. Sexual relationships developed in these all-male environments, some consensual, others less so. The power dynamics were complicated by the hierarchy within the ludus and the general atmosphere of violence. Guards and trainers sometimes exploited gladiators sexually, using their power over life and death to coerce compliance. It was sexual abuse in an environment where victims had no recourse, and complaining could result in being sent to the arena with no chance of survival. Your possessions were minimal, perhaps a small personal item you'd managed to keep from your previous life, maybe a token from a fan if you'd survived fights and gained popularity. These tiny possessions became incredibly precious, representing the last threads connecting you to your identity before you became property. Some men guarded these items fiercely. Others gave them away before fights, afraid they'd be lost when they died. It was like having a photo album as your only connection to who you used to be. The nights before scheduled fights were particularly difficult. You lay in darkness knowing that in hours or days you'd walk into the arena where you might die. Some men spent these nights trying to prepare mentally, visualizing victory and survival. Others simply tried to survive the terror hour by hour until dawn came and they'd face whatever the arena held. A few made peace with death, accepting that this might be their last night alive. It was like waiting for execution, except the execution was public entertainment and might not even happen if you fought well enough. And through it all, the cramped quarters, the lack of privacy, the constant proximity to violence and death, you had to maintain yourself as a person. Remember that you were human, despite being treated as property. Find reasons to survive another day in conditions designed to break you. Some managed it through religion, others through friendships, some through sheer stubbornness. But the living conditions were calculated to remind you constantly you were owned, you were controlled, and your comfort mattered only to the extent it affected your value as entertainment. Now, we arrive at the moment that everything in your miserable existence had been building toward, the arena. This wasn't where glory lived. This was where men died for entertainment while crowds ate snacks and cheered. This was where all the training, all the conditioning, all the dehumanization culminated in you walking onto sand that was literally designed to absorb blood efficiently. It was like preparing your entire life for a job interview where success meant not dying and failure meant death. And either way, you were performing for people who saw you as a thing rather than a person. The day of your fight began long before dawn. You were awakened early, given a final meal that might be your last, and allowed time to prepare mentally. Though, how does one prepare mentally for walking into scheduled death? Some men prayed to their gods, making offerings and asking for protection. Others simply sat inside, confronting their terror privately. A few tried to maintain normalcy, joking with companions or checking equipment obsessively. It was like preparing for any performance, except the performance involved mortal combat, and the audience wanted to see you bleed. The procession to the amphitheater was itself a public spectacle. Gladiators walked through Rome's streets, already in costume and carrying weapons, while citizens watched and commented. Some spectators would bet on you, others would discuss your chances. A few might throw insults or encouragement. You were paraded like livestock, which essentially is valuable animals being led to potential slaughter. It was like a perp walk combined with a parade, where you were simultaneously criminal and attraction. Arriving at the amphitheater, you saw the massive structure that would frame your potential death. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 people who would watch you fight and potentially die for their entertainment. The building was a monument to Roman engineering and Roman cruelty, beautiful in its construction and horrifying in its purpose. It was like walking into a sports stadium, except the sport was mortal combat, and you were the ball. Beneath the arena floor was a complex network of tunnels, rooms, and mechanical systems, the hypogum. This underground area housed gladiators, animals, and equipment. Mechanical lifts raised fighters and beasts into the arena dramatically. It was backstage for death entertainment, where the machinery of spectacle was hidden from audiences who wanted to believe in the glory they were watching. It was like being backstage at a theater, except the play was your possible death, and the stage machinery was designed to make that death surprising and dramatic. While waiting in these underground chambers, you heard the roar of the crowd above. The sound was physical, a vibration you felt in your bones. 50,000 people creating a noise that was simultaneously exciting and terrifying. They were excited for what was coming. You were terrified of it. The disconnect between their anticipation and your fear was the core obscenity of the games. It was like hearing a party happening where you're the entertainment that might be destroyed for their amusement. The warm-up acts went first. The Noxii, criminals sentenced to death, who were sent out with minimal weapons or even unarmed to be killed by professional fighters or wild animals. These weren't real fights. They were executions disguised as entertainment. You watched these men die while waiting for your turn. Their deaths a reminder of what awaited if you didn't perform adequately. It was like watching your coworkers being fired in the most permanent way possible, knowing your performance review was next. Then came the animal hunts, the venations, where professional beast hunters fought imported exotic animals. Lions, tigers, bears, elephants, even ostriches and deer were killed in elaborate staged hunts. The animals, confused and terrified, were forced into combat with hunters. It was cruelty, a spectacle demonstrating Roman power over nature through systematic slaughter of wildlife. It was like a zoo, where instead of observing animals, you killed them for entertainment, and the killing was the point. Finally, your moment arrived. The announcement came, your name called, your opponent identified. You climbed the ramp or rode the mechanical lift to arena level, emerging into blinding sunlight and deafening noise. 50,000 people screaming, the sound hitting you like a physical force. The sand beneath your feet was already stained dark, blood from previous fights that the fresh sand covering couldn't entirely hide. It was like walking onto a stage for the most important performance of your life, except performance meant fighting to not die. The arena floor was roughly 280 by 180 feet. Not huge, but large enough that you couldn't escape your opponent, small enough that the audience could see every detail of the combat. The sand was special. It absorbed blood efficiently, providing good footing even when soaked with the stuff. The Romans had engineered everything, including the surface you'd bleed on. It was like a performance space optimized for its specific function, which was facilitating entertaining death. You wore your specific gladiator-type equipment. If you were a mamillo, you had a large rectangular shield, a gladius sword, a visored helmet, and arm and leg protection. Heavy equipment that limited mobility but provided protection. If you were a retiarius, you had a net, a trident, and minimal armor. Speed and range were your advantages. Each gladiator type had specific equipment designed not just for combat effectiveness, but for creating interesting visual matchups that audiences enjoyed. It was like being assigned character classes that were balanced not for fairness, but for entertainment value. Your opponent emerged from the opposite side. Perhaps he was a prisoner like you, equally terrified and trying not to show it. Perhaps he was a volunteer who had fought many times, his eyes already dead from seeing too much death. Perhaps he was a criminal sentenced to die, given weapons, but no real chance. You looked at him knowing one simple fact. You'd been told to fight, and fighting meant trying to kill this person you'd never met, who had done nothing to you, whose only crime was being in the same horrible situation. The referee, the summa rudis, and his assistant gave final instructions. The rules varied by fight type and sponsor preference, but generally, fight until one of you was clearly defeated, no fleeing the combat, no attacking the audience or referees, and perform well because boring fights disappointed sponsors who could have you punished. It was like getting rules for a game, except the game was lethal and the penalties for rule violations included death. The trumpet sounded. The fight began. Combat wasn't the choreographed movie fights you've seen. It was desperate, exhausting, terrifying, and often technically awkward. You tried to kill someone who was trying to kill you, both of you aware that crowds wanted entertainment more than efficiency. A quick kill might save your life but disappoint the audience, potentially angering the sponsor who could then match you against impossible odds next time. It was like having a job where doing it too efficiently got you punished, so you had to pace your work even when your work was Mortal Kombat. The weight of your equipment became apparent immediately. That armor and weapons you'd trained with for months suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Your arms ached from holding your shield. Your helmet limited vision and made breathing difficult. You were already tired and the fight had just started. It was like running a marathon while fighting, except the marathon was a few minutes long but felt like hours and the fighting was lethal. Your opponent was equally exhausted, equally terrified, equally desperate. You circled each other, looking for openings, making tentative attacks, trying to read each other's patterns. The crowd roared at every near miss, every dramatic movement. They wanted blood. They'd paid for blood, and you'd better provide it or face consequence. It was like performing while your performance was being graded by thousands of people whose entertainment determined your future. The first blood came. Perhaps you cut your opponent's arm. Perhaps he stabbed your thigh. The crowd roared louder. Blood made things real, made things exciting. That blood was human pain transformed into entertainment, and the audience loved it. You felt the pain, the hot wetness of blood on your skin, the knowledge that you'd been injured, you couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying. It was like getting hurt at work, but knowing your job required you to continue regardless of injury. The fight continued. Minutes that felt like hours. Exhaustion built rapidly. Combat was intensely draining even in short bursts. Your muscles screamed, your lungs burned, your vision narrowed to just your opponent and the immediate space around you. The crowd became background noise. You were too focused on survival to process their roaring. It was like the worst workout of your life, combined with someone actively trying to kill you. Eventually, one fighter gained decisive advantage. Perhaps you managed to disarm your opponent or knock him down or injure him severely enough that he couldn't continue effectively. Perhaps it was you who fell, you who dropped your weapon, you who lay on the sand bleeding while your opponent stood over you with blade ready. This was the moment that determined everything. If you were losing, you could raise a finger, the ad digitum gesture requesting mercy. This wasn't surrender in the military sense. It was appealing to the crowd and the sponsor for your life. You'd fought, you'd provided entertainment, you'd bled for their amusement. Now you asked them to let you live. It was like asking your boss for mercy after failing at your job, except your boss was 50,000 strangers, and your failure was losing a fight to the death. The crowd's decision wasn't based on justice, fairness, or any noble principle. They decided based on whether you'd entertain them adequately. Did you fight bravely? Did you provide good drama? Were you a favorite they wanted to see again? Or were you boring, cowardly, or simply someone they enjoyed watching die? Their decision was expressed through gestures. Thumbs turned. The exact gesture is historically debated, but the concept was clear, either for mercy or death. The sponsor had final say. The editor of the games, usually a wealthy citizen or politician hosting the event, made the ultimate decision. He'd consider the crowd's wishes because disappointing them was politically stupid, but he'd also consider his budget. Dead gladiators were expensive losses, his relationship with the lanista, killing valuable property-damaged business relationships, and his personal whim. Your life depended on the political calculations of a man who'd never met you and saw you as an expense item rather than a person. If mercy was granted, you lived to fight another day. You'd survived, but survival meant returning to the ludus, recovering from injuries, and eventually doing this again. Each survival was temporary. Each mercy granted was just a delay of the inevitable. It was like getting a stay of execution. Relief was temporary, because you knew you'd face the same situation again. If death was decided, your opponent was ordered to kill you. You were expected to die with dignity, to kneel or stand still, to not beg or cry, to make the kill clean and quick. This final performance of dignity was your last act, the final entertainment you'd provide. Some men managed it, maintaining composure in the face of death. Others broke, begging and crying, which the crowd sometimes enjoyed and sometimes found distasteful. It was like your last moment of life being evaluated for entertainment value. Your death itself a performance with standards you were expected to meet. The kill was supposed to be quick, a sword thrust to the throat or chest, ending you rapidly. Sometimes it was quick. Sometimes the killing blow was imperfect, and you died slowly, painfully, bleeding out on the sand while the crowd cheered your death as entertainment. Sometimes the killer was inexperienced or shaking with exhaustion, making the death messier than intended. There was no dignity in it, no glory, no honor, just a human being dying badly while people who'd never known you celebrated. If you won, you experienced a complex mixture of relief, guilt, and exhaustion. You'd survived, but you'd killed someone to do it. That person might have been a criminal who deserved death, or might have been a prisoner of war who'd done nothing wrong, or might have been a volunteer forced by desperation into this horror. You'd taken their life to preserve your own, and you'd done it while thousands cheered. It was like succeeding at your job where success required ending someone else. And the success was celebrated by people who'd watch you die just as happily if the fight had gone differently. Victory brought rewards, prize money, gifts from the sponsor, possibly gifts from fans who'd bet successfully on you. If you fought exceptionally well, you might receive the palma, a palm branch symbolizing victory. If you'd had a particularly notable career, you might eventually receive the rudes, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom. Though this was rare, most gladiators died before earning freedom. It was like climbing a career ladder, where each rung was another fight survived, and the top of the ladder was freedom that most never reached. You left the arena exhausted, injured, covered in your own blood and possibly your opponent's, while the crowd already forgot you because the next fight was starting. You'd been the center of 50,000 people's attention, and now you were nothing. Just another slave being led back to the ludus to be patched up for the next performance. It was like being a rock star for minutes and then returning to being property, the contrast making both states more unreal. The psychological toll of arena combat was immense. You'd killed people. You'd nearly died yourself, possibly multiple times. You'd performed violence while thousands cheered. Some gladiators became emotionally numb, killing without feeling, their humanity eroded by repeated trauma. Others developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD, plagued by nightmares and constant anxiety. A few maintained their humanity through it all, though at great psychological cost. It was like being a war veteran, except the war never ended, and the next battle was always scheduled. And this was your life as a gladiator, the training, the preparation, the walk to the arena, the combat, the killing or dying, and if you survived, returning to the ludus to do it all again. There was no glory in it, no honor, no nobility, just exploitation, suffering, and death turned into entertainment for people who'd never risk what you risked, who'd never face what you faced, who saw your suffering as something they'd paid to watch. Before we conclude, we need to talk about something that might surprise you. Female gladiators existed, and their experience was somehow even more complicated and degrading than male gladiators faced. Women fighting in the arena were called gladiatrices, and they were rare but real, documented in historical records, artwork, and archaeological evidence. Their existence reveals something dark about Roman entertainment culture. The exploitation of women's bodies for entertainment was so profitable that even deeply patriarchal Roman society permitted it in this specific context. Most gladiatrices were slaves, just like male gladiators. Some were prisoners of war from territories Rome conquered. Others were criminals sentenced to the arena. A few were volunteers, women so desperate that selling themselves into combat slavery seemed preferable to their alternatives. It was like all the horror of male gladiatorial slavery with an additional layer of sexual exploitation and social degradation specific to being female in Roman society. The training for gladiatrices was similarly brutal to male training, possibly worse because it had to overcome Roman society's assumption that women were inherently weaker. Female gladiators trained with the same intensity, practiced the same movements endlessly, and learned the same combat skills. But they also faced sexual harassment and exploitation that male gladiators, while also vulnerable, experienced differently. It was like being in a profession where sexual exploitation was built into the job along with the scheduled violence. Female gladiator fights were considered novelty acts by many Romans. Exotic entertainment that broke social norms in controlled ways that audiences found titillating rather than threatening. Women fighting each other or even fighting dwarfs, another degrading novelty act, was marketed as unusual spectacle. It was like being both a fighter and a sideshow attraction. where your gender made your exploitation somehow more entertaining to audiences. The sexual exploitation was overt and intentional. Gladiatrices sometimes fought topless or in minimal clothing, their combat sexualized for audience enjoyment. They were objectified simultaneously for their ability to fight and their bodies, their combat skills, and their femininity, both marketed as entertainment. It was like being required to be sexy while fighting to the death. Your sexuality and your mortality both commodified for profit. Some wealthy Roman women attended these fights specifically to see gladiatresses, finding inspiration in women who broke gender norms through violence. A few upper-class Roman women even trained in gladiatorial arts privately, though this was scandalous and condemned by conservative Romans who believed women fighting was disgraceful. The existence of female gladiators somehow both challenged and reinforced gender hierarchies. Women could fight like men, but only as enslaved entertainment. It was like feminism filtered through exploitation, where breaking gender barriers came at the cost of being property. The historical record shows that female gladiator fights were eventually banned by Emperor Septimius Severus around 200 AD, not because Romans suddenly developed moral objections to forcing women to kill each other for entertainment, but because upper-class Roman women were increasingly interested in gladiatorial training, which threatened social order. Poor women dying in the arena was entertainment. Rich women training to fight was unacceptable. It was class boundaries being enforced through controlling female violence, caring about exploitation only when it affected the wrong class of women. Female gladiators who survived fights faced even more complicated existence than male survivors. They returned to the ludus, recovered from injuries, and faced future fights just like men. But they also faced sexual exploitation by guards, trainers, and anyone with power over them. Their bodies were valuable both for combat and for sexual use, and Roman law provided no protection for enslaved women from rape by their owners or supervisors. It was like living in a workplace where sexual harassment was legally permitted and fighting to the death was your actual job description. The few gladiatrices who earned freedom faced social stigma that male gladiators didn't experience quite the same way. A freed male gladiator might open a business or train new fighters, finding some social acceptance. A freed gladiatrix was a woman who'd been both a slave and a fighter, violating gender norms in ways Roman society couldn't quite forgive. Her past made her unmarriageable by Roman standards and limited her options. It was like escaping slavery but carrying a scarlet letter that prevented reintegration into normal society. The entertainment industry around gladiatorial games was vast and complex, involving far more than just the fighters dying in the arena. Behind every fight was a massive infrastructure of exploitation, profit, and calculated cruelty. Understanding this industry reveals that gladiatorial combat wasn't just about the fights. It was an entire economy built on human suffering. The Lanistae, gladiator trainers and owners, ran profitable businesses. They purchased slaves, trained them, and rented them out for games at rates that reflected the gladiators' skill levels and crowd appeal. A famous gladiator could be very expensive to rent, his appearance fees generating significant profit. It was like being an athlete whose contract was owned by someone else, except the sport was lethal and you got none of the money. Betting on gladiatorial fights was enormous business. Romans bet on individual fights, on which gladiator would win, on how long fights would last, on whether mercy would be granted. Massive amounts of money changed hands based on combat outcomes. Some gladiators were financially successful for their owners purely through the betting revenue their fights generated. It was like sports betting, except the athletes were slaves fighting to death, and the betting was the primary revenue source. Sponsors of games spent enormous sums to host spectacles. Politicians used gladiatorial games to win popular support, bankrolling expensive events to demonstrate their wealth and generosity. The games were political tools, bread and circuses used to keep the populace entertained and distracted. Your death might help some politician win an election. Your suffering serving political ambitions you'd never benefit from. It was like your entire existence being a campaign expense for someone else's career. The Colosseum and other amphitheaters were massive construction projects requiring armies of workers, sophisticated engineering, and enormous budgets. These buildings were monuments to Roman power and Roman cruelty, architectural marvels designed specifically to facilitate entertaining mass death. The infrastructure for your exploitation was magnificent in its construction and horrible in its purpose. It was like building a beautiful stadium specifically for scheduled murder. Vendors sold food, drinks, and souvenirs at the games. Audiences ate while watching you fight, snacked while you bled, discussed their purchases while you died. The casualness of their consumption while witnessing your suffering revealed how thoroughly dehumanized you were. You weren't a person dying, but a show being performed. It was like being entertainment so normalized that people ate popcorn while watching you potentially die. Artists created mosaics, sculptures, and paintings depicting famous gladiators and memorable fights. Your image might be reproduced, your likeness sold, your combat immortalized, all without your consent or benefit. You were intellectual property whose image could be commercialized even as you remained property yourself. It was like being famous without any of the benefits of fame. Your exploitation extended even to your image. Some gladiators achieved celebrity status. Successful fighters became famous, their names known throughout Rome, their victories discussed by people who'd never meet them. Female fans sent erotic messages. Children played games pretending to be famous gladiators. This celebrity was real, but ultimately meaningless. You were famous slaves, admired entertainment, popular property. It was like being an influencer, except you influenced nothing, had no agency, and your popularity just made you more valuable as property. The children of gladiators inherited their parents' status. If you were enslaved and had children through relationships with female slaves or through rape by female owners, your children might be born into gladiatorial slavery. Your suffering could extend across generations, your legacy being children forced into the same exploitation. It was like a family business, except the business was scheduled death, and nobody chose to be in it. Retired gladiators, those rare individuals who survived long enough to earn freedom, sometimes stayed in the industry as trainers, their knowledge of combat and survival valuable. They trained the next generation of enslaved fighters, perpetuating the system that had exploited them. Some did it because they had no other skills, others because the industry was the only world they knew, a few because they'd internalized the values of their oppressors. It was like escaping slavery only to become a manager in the slavery business. Your freedom compromised by your continued participation in exploitation. The eventual decline of gladiatorial games came not from moral awakening, but from economic and social changes. As Christianity became the dominant Roman religion, some emperors restricted the games on religious grounds. The cost of maintaining the infrastructure became less justifiable as the empire declined. The supply of prisoners from conquests decreased as Roman expansion slowed. The games ended not because Romans suddenly recognized the immorality, but because the circumstances that enabled the exploitation changed. It was like a horrible business closing due to economic conditions rather than ethical reconsideration. As our journey through a gladiator's real life comes to an end, we need to confront what all of this actually meant. The life of a gladiator wasn't glorious. It was a horror story of exploitation, degradation, and death for entertainment. Every aspect of your existence was designed to maximize profit from your suffering while maintaining the illusion of honor and glory that made audiences comfortable watching human beings kill each other. You lived as property. You trained to die entertainingly. You killed people who'd done nothing to you. You faced death repeatedly for the entertainment of people who saw you as less than human. And if you survived long enough to earn freedom, you carried the trauma of everything you'd experienced, everything you'd done, everyone you'd killed or watched die. The modern romanticization of gladiators reveals our continued discomfort with the reality. We want to believe in honor, glory, and choosing death with dignity. We want movies where gladiators are heroes and the arena is noble. We want the spectacle without confronting what made the spectacle possible: the systematic exploitation of human beings as expendable entertainment. The truth is uglier and more important. Gladiatorial combat was industrial-scale cruelty, entertainment built on suffering, profit extracted from death. It was slavery in its most visible and degrading form, where the exploitation was literally performed before audiences who'd paid to watch. The next time you see a movie about gladiators, remember the reality. Remember the slaves who had no choice. Remember the training designed to break them. Remember the fights that ended in death for someone's entertainment. Remember that the glory was a lie told to make the exploitation acceptable, that the honor was mythology constructed to let audiences feel good about watching people die. Gladiators weren't warriors choosing honorable death. They were enslaved people forced to kill or die for profit and entertainment. Their lives were brutal, short, and defined by exploitation. Some survived, most died, all suffered, and the suffering was the point. It was what audiences paid to see. And so ends our journey through a gladiator's real life. If you enjoyed this confrontation with difficult historical reality, subscribe for more explorations into the truth. Let me know in the comments which aspect of gladiatorial life was most shocking to you, or which other historical topic you'd like us to explore. Rest well, time traveler, and perhaps appreciate that you live in a time where human beings killing each other isn't considered acceptable entertainment. At least not literally, not in the ways Rome practiced it. Sweet dreams.